Welcome to Silver Lining for Learning, episode 95. And this episode, we got two very special guests. We got Dr. Carole Basile from Arizona State University, who is the Dean of the College of Education. We got Dr. Rick Ginsberg, who is the Dean of the School of Education and Human Sciences at the University of Kansas. On this show, we've talked a lot about how to prepare teachers, or how do we get in better researchers, and how schools of education have responded to the challenges of the pandemic and many other things. So we have two deans here, and they will be giving us their perspectives. So why don't we just get started with Carole? Could you introduce yourself and say a few things that you've done during the pandemic?
Oh my goodness. I'm Carole Basile. I'm the Dean of the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College at Arizona State University. What haven't we done during the pandemic? I have been at ASU for 6 years, former Dean at the University of Missouri St. Louis, and had been in Colorado before that, and Houston before that, and have about 15 years of a business background before I came back to education. And we have been really thinking about, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this, but what we call the next education workforce, and really thinking now about what's happening is we're watching our students come into the field, not as many as we would like, obviously, there's been a decrease, but also the fact that they're leaving so quickly. And really thinking about what do we do about that, and the fact that this just can no longer be a recruitment retention problem. This has to be a workforce design and development problem.
All right, thank you, Carole. And well, Rick actually is technically my dean, so I got to be very careful. So here's Dr. Rick Ginsberg. Can you introduce yourself and say a few things of what you've been doing during the pandemic?
Well, thank you, and it's appreciate your having both Carole and I on. Again, Rick Ginsberg. I've been the dean here at KU. This is my 17th year. I was in a similar role in Colorado State for 10 years. You all know that admonition, those that can't dean. Well, my picture shows up when you see that. I've been doing this for 27 years. I think Camilla Bembo at Vanderbilt and I are the two longest sitting deans in the country right now. It's been a struggle during the pandemic. Our numbers have stayed relatively flat. That's not true across the country. I think Arizona has been a real outlier in some ways on the positive side, but Arizona State. One of the big challenges is that teaching has been really hard for those in the field, and young people look at that and they think, why would I put myself through that? And we'll end up talking about that, I think, at some length. I think there's going to be a mass exodus over the course of years. So we were talking about that before the pandemic, and the pandemic can certainly probably strengthen that. I think Carole's quite right. It's not just recruitment, and it's not just retention, what our research colleagues call the leaky bucket. It's a whole approach to managing the teaching workforce. And it's going to be a challenge, I think, going forward. The big issue for us during the pandemic, I think, has been around, this is for our faculty and staff and for our students and for the people in the field, a lot of challenges with emotional and mental health, what the New York Times has referred to as languishing. I think they've stolen that from psychologists who call it floundering, but I think languishing really does express how an awful lot of people are feeling, and it affects the work that Carole and I do, I think.
So, one of the things that we've been talking a lot about is the pandemic has created opportunities for innovation. And in K-12 schools, a lot of the innovations have to be carried out by teachers. And we were just wondering, do you see any possibility, or do you see, maybe you're already doing this, that how are we changing in teacher preparation? Are we trying to instill in them new skills, new capacities, new attitudes, or are we keeping the same way, or are we even preparing them in different ways, when they cannot come to school? What kind of things we have? Either Rick or Carole, feel free to jump in.
Carol, go ahead. I'll follow you up.
I think one of the things there are two things I think that we learned through the pandemic. One is that people want flexibility, and two is that people do not want to be isolated. And when we look at the teaching profession, we see both. It is an inflexible job, and it is isolating. You ask somebody to go into a classroom, they have to know everything to be able to serve those 25 or 30 kids or more in some places. And the job today is just not tenable. And so one of the things that we have been working on over the last really 4 years before the pandemic is really thinking about how we can be more flexible, how we can bring more people into the field of education, not just think about teachers, but think about educators more broadly, and think about how we break down the isolation of teachers. So we're talking a lot about teams. We're working with schools around how we create teams. Our faculty are starting to work in teams. We're breaking down that one teacher, one classroom model in the college, the way that we do student success, the way that our units function. We're trying to both model and then also to support our students in practice in schools to also learn to work in teams. So that's a major shift for us, but it's also a shift as we think about the paraprofessionals who are out there and the aides and community educators and how we as a college of education actually liberate our content and allow more people to have access to it. Because a college of education's, the only way you get our content about how to teach is to come into a program, pay tuition, and become a professional teacher. And we're trying to break all that down and to think very differently about how everybody today needs to know something about how to teach, but also then how we work with our professional teachers, those who want to go into classrooms, to start working on teams, to bring other people in. And we start saying, if here's a group of kids, not your 30, here's your 30 kids, your 30 kids, and your 30 kids. We say, here's a group of kids. Let's figure out who the adults are that we need to prepare and how we build that group of adults around that group of kids.
I like that. I like what you said. You'll make this accessible. So that means if I want to be a teacher, I in any other country, I can access your content. Is that the idea?
Yes.
I know you're trying to work. Okay.
Right. So, how do we break it down into, we're creating a platform for what we call community educators, people that we would like. We saw right in the pandemic, parents who now are home with kids who are going, oh my gosh, I don't know how to teach my kid how to read. I don't know how to teach, I need help, right? And so we're trying to take all of what we know and how we break that down into 20-minute little modules to be able to provide that for people now who may go into schools, who work on teams, work with teachers, people who are now, high dosage tutoring is now a thing. All the people that are doing those kinds of things. So, but they need to know something. You just don't walk into schools and say, here's a worksheet, go do something with these kids. And so I think we're trying to figure that out. We're trying to think about how we offer our courses for credit, but also for non-credit, right? As people want to come in and want to know about teaching and what that looks like. And then just provide many, many more flexible pathways to get there. How we think about how work counts, right? That all these students, they're all working and trying to go to school. And so how do we figure out how their working environment is actually a learning environment? So we become more flexible in what we do and more pathways. And that's what we're up against. I mean, we're seeing legislation now that, wants more pathways. But if we don't figure it out first, then it's going to be, we're going to put everybody that breathes in a classroom, and that's not right either.
All right, Rick.
If I can, throw in one thing here before we break. Episode 78 of Silver Lining for Learning had Brent Madden and Krista Adams, who, if people what you are watching, if they're interested to understand the next education workforce model, could be another episode worth listening to. So I just wanted to put in a plug there.
Thank you for that. I've got a lot of thoughts on this, and some similar to what Carole said. It's a challenging situation. I'm not. Many of us know Posse Salberg. Posse has written that everybody thinks that everything's going to be dramatically different when and if the pandemic ever changes. And he cautioned, that's not been the history of change and reform in this country, and he may be right. And I think about how many people just want to take off their masks and just want to go back out and go back to quote unquote normal. And in the schools, quote unquote normal is not what Carole described or what I might describe as something quite different. And Carole alluded to this, there's political pressures that are taking place now about what you can teach and what you couldn't teach. And there's going to be recording of people, and you can get fined if you hurt people's feelings and all that. And, you know, one has to recognize that that is going to constrain rather dramatically what teachers are willing or not willing to do. I mean, one of my mantras has been is that it's, and look, let's be clear. I mean, this pandemic has exacerbated inequalities that existed prior to it. There's been just an awful lot of difficulty for teachers and students. On the other hand, very few people really talk about the positive sides of the pandemic, and that's why I really like this question. I mean, for how many decades have we been told that universities never change, and we all changed within 2 weeks? We went 100% online, and we all have learned different skills, and the same is exactly true in the K-12 space. Now, it differs from district to district, and we've had to learn how to operate differently. We've had to learn, as Carole talked about, how to help parents who were stuck teaching kids at home that had no clue what they were doing. And so us formalizing that. I mean, one of my fears is that if we go too far adrift, we completely deprofessionalize a profession that's already struggling with attracting young people to come into a profession that doesn't pay all that well and the like. So we have to go into this, I think, with our eyes open. But I think on the positive side, not only have we shown that we can change, I think a vast majority of people in our culture, teachers and students, have shown themselves to be incredibly resilient. I think young people and teachers have learned how to organize their time in ways that they never had to think about organizing their time. I think you could. I think about Phil Jackson's work on life in the classroom and how you have to look at both the formal curriculum and the non-formal curriculum and understanding what happens in education. I think a lot of that has in some ways been strengthened through what we've gone through. Much like what Carole talked about, I think that we've got to look at different ways of delivering things. I mean, Young has really led us in this. We're creating what we're calling a global education academy, where we're putting education into small snippets of things that we can make available, some for free and some you want to commoditize so you can continue to go on in the future. And you would offer a credential upon that. So there'd be nano credentials and mini credentials that might stack to micro credentials that might stack to something else, but different ways of getting things out, different ways of teaching. Just was at I don't know, Young, if you were at the research festival that we did of our faculty yesterday, but lots of apps being created to support parents and teachers and kids, for example, with how do you teach some of these resiliency skills, the social emotional skills that become political in some spaces and less political in others. But the only thing I would submit, we've got to look at that, at the political culture that's out there that's going to constrain an awful lot of what we might do, and figure out how we get to that. We're able to do the things that Carole talked about and not be beat back for that. I'm really worried about people's willingness to stay in this profession and go into this profession, no matter how you characterize the work. It's very real that schools were places where kids in many places just didn't wear masks and adults had to go to work. I mean, we at the university complained about it, but in the healthcare world and in the K-12 space, there were no choices. You had to do it. So we've got to deal with these things and make this profession attractive. Some of the things that Carole talked about, and some of the things we have going on, maybe ways to do that. But I think it's going to be it's going to be some hard work. It's got a lot of uphill work going forward.
Chris, do you have a question?
Yeah. One of the things that's very unfortunate that's happening now is that remote instruction and remote learning are being vilified, portrayed as evil by many politicians, certainly by the media, and by some parents. And, the media are buying into this hook, line, and sinker. They'll find some child that didn't like remote learning, but they never put on an interview with a child that did or that benefited from remote learning. The politicians who mishandled remote learning don't want the blame for doing a poor job, and so they're blaming the medium rather than blaming the way that it was done. And that's a very unfortunate thing. And one of the reasons it's unfortunate is that we have gone through a sea change in how the world works outside of education. And we're not going back. Business is not going back to face only. No way. And civic life is not going back to face only either. So if schools, either by choice or by political pressure, end up being all face-to-face, all that they're doing is guaranteeing that their graduates are going to struggle when they get to the world. So that's my perspective, and I'm interested in your take on my perspective. But the consequence of that perspective, if you buy into it, is that teachers need to learn how to teach remotely, as well as learning how to teach face-to-face in classrooms. And I'm not aware of teacher education in general wrestling with that issue, including at Harvard. Maybe they're saying, well, there might be specialist teachers who are good at teaching online, but you don't see medical schools preparing people who are specialist doctors that do face-to-face and specialist doctors who do telemedicine. It's silly even to think about it that way. So how do you think that there will be a movement in teacher education that recognizes the world that students are graduating into, and that recognizes that teachers themselves need to be fluent in both face-to-face and remote?
Yeah, I think that's happening. I'd be honest with you. I mean, there's, you know, to go back to your initial point, Chris, I mean, there's ample evidence that you learn as well. You don't change the cognitive processes. The vehicle doesn't change the learning outcomes particularly much. But you are right. There's many states that have passed legislation that don't allow you to have more than X number of hours of online teaching. So I mean, you're quite right about the context. That said, and Carole, I mean, you might talk about this too. I think that we've moved to hybridized kinds of models and providing training to our candidates in both online and face-to-face instruction. I think that we've all learned, for example, that you can even do field experiences in an online capacity. We've all been forced into that to some degree, and I think it's been quite successful. I think that there will be, Young and I have been working with a cache of teachers and educators up in Canada, and they give families choices whether or not they want to be face-to-face or online or some kind of hybridized model. I actually think that's probably what we're going to find. You know, one of the things that schools have done traditionally that they continue to do is that they're the lowest paid babysitters in the world. I mean, they make it possible for parents to go to work. So there will be families that need to have their children, you know, in school settings. But I do think that there will be a lot of kids and parents that do ask for and opt for online instruction. I mean, our district here, as an example, and I don't think we're an outlier, has had a virtual school for years, and it's growing, and it will continue to grow. And we are offering training to our pre-service teachers in online instruction. And we haven't had to do that much training recently because they've all been living it. One of the dilemmas that you have is technology is sporadic in terms of its quality. Young, you might remember with the global deans, we were hearing from Edinburgh about how they have this incredible laboratory that has the highest quality technology that makes face-to-face or Zoom or asynchronous, whatever, really possible. But the cost of that is phenomenal. And it, frankly, the technology has a shelf life of about 12 months to 18 months. And then you got to get the next thing. That's incredibly expensive. So, I mean, there's a lot of factors that are shaping this, but I would say the field is slowly, we've been dragged into it, but I do think that the field is opening up to preparing our educators so that they can exist in an online fashion. Indeed, the highest growing market in education is the online master space related to teacher education. And ASU is, we've got a fairly decent sized one, but ASU, Southern Cal, and others have been leaders in that for a long time. I don't know, Carole, your thoughts on it?
Yeah, Chris, I couldn't agree more. We've had, since all this started, we now have an internship for our students where we've got 500 students working we have an ASU Prep Digital, which is our K-12 virtual school. And so we have shifted that direction, but I think it's also more than that. I think that it is around, we go back to these staffing models. So we have 30 schools right now that are moving with us, and many, many more now across the country that we think are going to link arms here, particularly with the Superintendent's Association and others around thinking about what these sort of team-based models look like. And now we're talking about what do blended team-based models look like? Because there's no question that when you start talking about rural or you talk about tribal or, any of those kind of places, I mean, the pandemic is one thing, but we've all been through hurricanes and, there's going to be something. This is not the first or the last large disruption to school systems. And so, I mean, I think the good news is that people are trying to figure this out, but they're going to have to figure out how there are teachers who poured in, rural districts who are never, ever going to find enough physics teachers or math teachers or the expertise that they need in those communities. They're going to have to figure out how to use remote learning. We're seeing AI. AI is only going to grow. It's going to become much bigger. That side of technology, I think, is also part of this conversation. And our teacher candidates need to know how to use it well, how to monitor it, how to really pay attention to where kids get stuck. I think there are new jobs in the education field now around thinking about people who are lab facilitators, who are thinking about how to work remotely, how to teach remotely. I think there are people now who are in companies that we're building some things, right, where those folks who need to bring expertise to kids that aren't in schools today have an opportunity to come in and be problem-based mentors, right, for kids. That's all going to be remote. They're not going to leave their office to do it. And then there's
Carole, can I just add something that we built in something called a virtual learning network, and it's a part of our student teaching year-long field-based thing, and it's all online. We use the app Slack. That if you use Slack, it has different channels. It's facilitated by practicing teachers in our partner schools who work with our undergraduates, and it's also a vehicle for professional. And so the channels are in an array of different things that are of interest to the practicing teachers as well as the teacher candidates. So we use it as a form of professional development. We're tying that into our alumni network so our alumni can come back and continue to get training. And as Carole described earlier, I mean, it's the kind of thing that you could open up further for the vast array of people that will be used here. Now, that's just one example of how this is, and I mean, we're doing this, but other people are doing similar kinds of things. Chris, I think it's pretty potent. It started, now, again, Carole, I would step back. We've always had hurricanes and snowstorms and everything. We've never had anything like this. This is different. I mean, yes, schools will break down now, but what we don't know, and my fear is that we maybe have a lot of stops and starts in schooling due to this virus for a long time. I hope I'm wrong, but that's what the epidemiologists are telling us to be fearful about. And so, I mean, this move to using technology more and to integrating candidates with professionals, with outsiders, I think is probably going to be a big part of the thrust along the formalized programs, Carole, that you've talked about, that you're doing with businesses and the like.
All right. Yeah. So I'm going to take a question, one of our consistent listeners, Gerald Fussell, but I'm going to expand that a little bit. So his question is the anticipated exodus of teaching, I'm guessing he's talking about, unique to the US, or is it broader than that? And I want to frame within that, sort of frame it slightly differently, which is education is this interesting space right now where it is uniquely contextual and local, right? Depending on where you are, the systems may be different or what students need to learn and, all of that. So there is a deep contextual localization to education and its value. But we also understand that we live in a world which is incredibly porous and global, and just the fact that this virus can spread this crazily, and the fact that all of us can come together and build these new mRNA vaccines, both speak to the sort of that global context as well. So building off of Gerald's question, what do you see is sort of the global context and this local, that intermixing? How does that play out in your view, either in teacher education or in education broadly speaking?
I think there's a lot of commonality, right? I think this is a global concern. I think it's been a global concern. You have countries that do not have highly qualified teachers in every classroom. They're going to have to think about this in different ways. I think the pandemic has exacerbated all of this. But there is no question we're not the only ones who are dealing with this. And there are those who have this, who have situations, I think, worse than we do when you look at, 1 to 60 or 1 to 100 ratios that we see in places, where we're working, on various projects. So, this is a global issue. And I think we see that reflected in some of the work by the Education Commission. We see it reflected in the latest UNESCO report. So this is, everybody is thinking about, what are we going to do and their education systems right now.
And Carole works we work together in this. We are a part of a group called the Global Education Deans Forum. Young was one of the individuals that helped us found this. It was founded by a couple of us in China and here in the States. And it's a group of education deans, primarily research universities, representing about 30 to 40 deans from around the world, representing, I think, 16 different countries and 5 continents. It's a lot of people. We get together once a year face-to-face when that's possible, and once a year, typically at AERA or some other vehicle. We've been obviously on the Zoom checkerboard the last couple of years, but the first year when we did it, I think young Bill McDermott and I asked all the deans what were the major issues that are facing them around education, on teacher education in their country. And the irony is that of all the deans that responded, it was about 25 or 30, it was the same issues. And I'll tell you what they were. Okay, I mean, the top issue is what we would call equity or social justice or diversity or inclusion here. Some places around the world, they called it immigration or migration, but it was the exact same issues about how do you educate different peoples. The second issue had to do around what Carole just talked about, the issues related to technology. Our Chinese colleagues talked an awful lot about AI. They're doing a lot of, on the apps that they have, they're doing a lot of AI tutoring for kids, for example, so they can get work at home. But the idea about how do we infuse state-of-the-art technology and how do we use technology to change instruction, not to be what Larry Cuban wrote about years ago, where it's periphery to what we do. So technology was second. The third one was teacher shortages. So going back to Gerald's question, it is a global issue. We're all facing the same issues. And I see collaboration across the globe as one way for us. We in the States don't have all the right answers and all the best answers, obviously, all the time. And we can learn from each other and grow together that way, I think.
I'm going to thank you for that. And I'm going to follow up with a question that Patrick Dixon, my former colleague from Michigan State, put in there. Speaking this broader idea of research. And I'm wondering, because one of the things that, universities we are engaged in at faculty are sort of promoted and rewarded for is research. And I'm so wondering, what do you think the role of research on there's a part of me which thinks that a lot of the education research that we do doesn't really inform the kinds of practices that they need to be informing, that we are doing it because now we are on this treadmill of citation counts and so on. So I'm wondering, for as positioned as deans who have an opportunity to frame research in new ways or different ways, what kinds of things are you thinking, that what kind of research would be most valuable going forward?
So in my view, it has to be research that's synergistic. It has to be research that's interdisciplinary. And I think, look, Punya, we're sort of headed this direction, right? We're certainly not there yet, but we've got to get faculty to start looking, I think, and being more future forward in their research. But I also think that comes not only from inside the colleges of ed, but also outside. And so building these sort of collaboratives that, lean not just to, what's happening in the college, or even what's happening right in somebody's very specific, narrow research. We've got to look at other areas. Look at the humanities, look at the social sciences, look at other fields. That's got to start informing. Look at business. It's got to start informing what we do and how we think about things. And I think we're making a mistake if we stay in our education silo. I say often that if educators keep talking to educators, we're going to keep getting what we've always gotten. We're going to have to branch out. We're going to have to think about this in some very, very unique ways. And that's the only way we're going to get there.
Interesting question. The most recent Global Education Deans Forum, we asked the deans what it was that they want to talk about. They wanted to talk about how research impacts practice. And those of you that have been around long enough remember Carole Weiss's book, 30, 40 years ago, that initially talked about the fact that research rarely impacts practice directly. And, if you've studied medicine, you know that from the time a study is published to the time it might impact practice, the average length of time is 17 years. And I'm a part of a group of deans that we actually have a lobbying group in Washington, and we work really hard to try to focus the funding agencies, NSF, NIH, IES, and the like, on focusing on research that actually can impact practice. And we convinced the director of IES to create vehicles for having research that proposals that can turn around really quickly, and then that can be out there impacting practice fairly soon. We were a part of the push to get that NSF IES collaboration on AI, that $10 million call that many of you may be aware of, that's out there soon. So that it strikes me that research has to focus on issues of improving schooling. We've done a pretty piss poor job, I think, over the years in showing, for example, what is it about teacher education that kind of works best, and what's the research behind that. And many times, people don't understand the nature of research is, it grows over time, and studies grow on top of each other. But we've got this whole K-12 world that is demanding help, and so what they do is they end up with a lot of snake oil that's not research backed, and that falls on our shoulders for not pushing research that we can turn around relatively quickly. And I would love to see a federal agency, much like the drug administration. I don't think the federal works. They try to do this, but a federal agency that puts a stamp on, look, this is the kind of thing that you can try, and that there's other research that's built around that. I mean, for years, if replicability studies were not published in our world. That was a big issue with ed researcher for years, and the like. So, I mean, we have to. It's kind of building on what Carole is saying in some respects, but we have to make sure that our researchers are studying our practice. Otherwise, there's no reason for education schools. We can be in sociology or economics or political science, whatever. And that's where I think that we have to go, is getting more of I'm not against basic research. I'm not arguing against that. Basic research is what leads to the studies that will change practice. But we have to have a lot of stuff there that's turned around quickly, that is vetted, so that we know what can affect. Otherwise, school districts are just kind of, I wrote a paper many years ago. It was around principal evaluation, and we studied hundreds of studies. We found out that the only research out there was what we called home remedies. Everybody talks about what it is that they did in their district, but no science around it. And so we've got to do better. And that does mean broadening the pool that's looking at what we're doing, and then getting funding for studies that I think that can have an impact on practice in positive ways.
Okay, I have a two-part question. And the first part addresses both of you. And the second part, we'll start with Carole. We'll see if Rick has an add-on to it. So Young asked, what'd you do during the past couple of years during the pandemic? But I'm more interested in what didn't you do that you're planning to do that's allowable to talk about on the airways and record anyhow. So what initiatives, projects, new ventures are just about ready to happen, or you're hoping to have happen that you didn't get to during the past couple of years? What things might we be hearing about from ASU or from Kansas or from your respective positions? And then have a follow-up for that.
Yeah, for us, it really has been this next education workforce. We have a number of schools, a number of districts now nationally that have been interested with us in looking at staffing models. And we started this pre-pandemic. And I think during the pandemic, it didn't take a hiatus. Things continued to grow and to develop. Certainly it was more difficult, as everybody's now trying to separate people 6 feet apart and all those kinds of things. But I think, right now our major initiative in the college is around thinking about how we are staffing schools. We're going to have to think very differently about it. I think it is our very, very large equity play as we think about how we're going to support kids and what we're going to do. We are really, I think, at a crisis. I think the way that staffing is right now, I think, is unsustainable. And I think, as we continue to work with schools and with some of these organizations, it's really our imperative. So that's really our major thing right now. The second thing that we have been doing really is called principled innovation. You mentioned it before. And this has really been looking at, there you go, a framework that we have built, but also now you can get online, put in Principled Innovation ASU, and you will find over 200 tools and materials and all kinds of things, really, really addressing the disposition, the character of our educators, how we begin to help our educators make decisions, not expediently, but really carefully, really in a number of different ways, and really think about those as assets of educators. In teacher preparation, we have for a very long time tried to figure out, ideas around disposition and professionalism and things like that. And this is something that we think could make a difference. And we are certainly seeing that now with our students as we've now built all of this into our teacher education program and beyond, that we really, really have to think about the decisions that we make every day, every second for kids, and how we do that, with persistence, resilience, curiosity, care, all of those kinds of things.
So Rick, you want to jump in before I ask part two?
Sure. The thing I haven't done is gone out to restaurants. I can say that, and I miss that a whole lot. So that's my immediate personal reaction. I don't want to. I'm going to tell you some things that we've done. The biggest part of my job has been taking care of people. People are really, really struggling. I mean, let's be honest about it. I mean, people are really struggling. Students are struggling. I was reading some data about the suicide rate, about adolescents and college-age kids. These things are all skyrocketing. We found a company that had a survey that would measure people's status on 15 non-cognitive variables. It's a company called MindView, and it compares where they are to some national norms that have been developed across a variety of different fields. And from that, people could get a sense of where they stood, and if they were struggling in an area, there were videos on self-help, and we could do kind of group things. I mean, that's just an example. I mean, doing lots of town halls and things, lots of professional development things. I mean, the big things that we've been working on that we really have to grow, getting out of it. I think Carole mentioned the equity issues. Equity concerns have exacerbated clearly through this pandemic. And a lot of it's because of lack of access to technology in some areas. What was it? City of Los Angeles said that they had no contact with 28% of the kids in the public school system. I mean, that's horrific when you think about it. But aside from that, I mean, we've been focusing a lot on partnerships, both across this region here, strengthening those partnerships, and across the world. Young knows that we're in the midst of pursuing a contract. He mentioned it earlier when we were talking with the Ministry of Education in China to develop an institute. We're going to deliver co-degrees, both undergraduate and graduate in education with a university in China. We through this Global Education Academy that I mentioned, we're going to be releasing hundreds or more of videos that were developed through research grants that will be much, we're pretty pronounced in the field of special education. These particular videos are all in special education. That will be free to any educator or parent that needs their help. And if they want to use that as a way to getting some kind of credential, we can commoditize it for ourselves that way. But I want to see more of these kinds of things. We've been working with school districts a lot about that. They're all struggling with some of the things we've talked about teaching online or having enough physics teachers and the like. So what can we do with them to provide support for them that they couldn't get otherwise? We've been offering free professional development for school districts and their staffs and frankly the general public for years. We used to do it in a one-day face-to-face thing. Now we've gone to doing it during the summer over a course of 4 weeks with multiple things that are presented both asynchronous and synchronously. We've got to build on those things and continue to develop these kinds of partnerships and supports that I think Carole mentioned.
So I think Rick kind of answered my part two. Carole, I was on your campus right before the pandemic, or a few months. I was at a conference in Glendale, and we popped over to Ed Plus. My former student, Peter Von Loosen, is there at Ed Plus. He's also in your college. And he gave us a tour. And, we found out about Dreamscape, Ed Plus. I've known about the Starbucks project for a while and about the Freshman Global Academy, which didn't quite work out. Mm-hmm. And, there's so much happening. And probably people who are going to be watching this show, when they see Arizona State, they see Kansas, they're going to want to know what innovations. They've heard things have been going on there, and there's a lot of change. You want to have 400,000 students by 2025 or 2030 or whatever. So, in the new business school project, 100 million learners, trying to get 100 million learners to take 5 business classes. That's fascinating because I got a book called The World is Open. I talk all about that. I interview people who are doing that stuff, So I'm curious, what in the School of Education or the college, Mary Lou Fulton College, our Teachers College, is it the Center for Advanced Studies for Global Education? Is that the pinnacle thing that people should look to and read about? And if so, can you talk to us about the Center for Advanced Studies in Global Education and what it's about and what it's done and what it's accomplished?
So that center in particular was our sort of center where everything international was happening. That is not a center anymore. So now that Iveta Silova that was managing that center is now an associate dean, because we felt that as we were continuing to get a number of USAID projects, as we also have programs and projects in China and some other places, as our international work was expanding. We actually have made that now a unit within the college, so it's not a center that's sitting out there by itself. That's one thing. The other thing that I think is important is the Center for Reinventing Public Education, which we now have brought to Arizona State. We're very proud of that. Robin Lake, Paul Hill, that group, which is now a part of ASU. So that's another group that I would definitely take a look at, because particularly as you're thinking about, learners and learning. So on the international side, lots of things happening, lots of models, lots of ways to see how schools, but also nonprofits, right, are beginning to think very differently about how they're serving learners and learner-centered. Also, I think SERPI is also has been looking at things all over the country around pods and all kinds of ways that I think that both schools and learners, right, are demanding, and parents, are demanding here in terms of the education for their kids. But I think it goes back to what I said earlier, which is, people want flexibility and they don't want isolation. And so, when you stand on those two things, that's a principle. Those are principles that I think that are going to lead education in some very, very interesting ways as we look toward the future, and we look, at where U.S. aid goes in the future, and how we begin to think about this, and how people are look to us, but for new ideas. But I think we're also looking very, very carefully at what's going on around the world to garner ideas, to see what's happening. And really think about lots of things. We are absolutely a global world, and that's so all of that is more than important right now.
Chris, can
Thanks.
I just jump in quickly? I think one of the big thrusts, and others are doing it already, but I think it's going to be a part of the future, is in higher education moving to more and more competency-based models, where people can get credentials without necessarily having to sit down in classes to get them. We're doing some work in that area. Our university is pushing big time into doing that. But one of the questions, and so I think you'll see more of that. I can't talk about it specifically, I wish I could, but we're negotiating with a really sophisticated competency-based other institution that we may acquire to really push us forward in these kinds of things. So we'll see how that all plays out going forward. But one thing I'd like to ask all of you to talk about, if I can turn the tables a little bit, and hell, I'm a dean, that's what we do, right? I mean, you guys have been asking us all of these questions, but one of the questions that strikes me, Chris, you asked the question about research, and we've been talking a lot about that. We have these structures on tenure and promotion now that are rather archaic, I think, and have been the same for an awfully long period of time. Many groups, for example, now share information on social media. A lot of minoritized groups have networks, and that's how they share information. Now you put that in your tenure promotion file and they'll laugh at you. You mean you had 4 million likes? Who cares? And so one of the questions I'd like you, especially those of you that are faculty members, to think about is, are we willing to break down some of the structures that we have? I'm not talking about getting rid of it, like our colleagues in Texas are talking about, or Iowa and Georgia are talking about. But if we're really going to move forward in the way that the world is talking, we're talking about here with technology, we're going to have to change the structures that we have in place that reward people for what they do, because it's those rewards is what's going to drive the behavior on every campus around the country. So how welcoming would you all be to saying, okay, let's blow that up and figure out better ways of doing it?
Chris,
How about we start with Chris, we go to Kurt, we go.
I will jump in. I mean, I really think that if you think about, these are citation counts and which journals you publish, and these are proxies for quality and impact, right? And I think that there is an absolutely worthwhile conversation to have about what we mean by quality and what we mean by impact. And in fact, I was talking with a faculty member recently, and they were putting the tenure package together, and the fact that a framework that they had developed is now being used as curriculum framework in 4 different universities, to me actually was much more impactful than the citation counts that they were showing, right? But again, I think that's a conversation that a college needs to have, and I would absolutely agree. I mean, I don't know about you, Zhao, but we were blogging from way back when. And I remember putting this in my annual review every year, that this year I wrote 50,000 words and had so many, and nobody cared about it, but I made sure that it was there, as a pointer that, listen, I mean, there is time that has gone into it, and that has an impact, that people read it and it makes a difference. So I think it's a very important conversation to have. Absolutely.
Yeah, at a minimum, you should have made copies of it and put it in your P&T file to piss people off. I mean, that would have been something you could have done.
I would always have a section where I would give whatever analytics I could get about hit sites and downloads, and and a number of words. I would just say, I wrote a book on my blog last year.
That's a good reminder. I need to turn in my annual evaluation. So I'm going to print my blogs. But Chris has a question and a response to Rick, I'm sure.
Well, I'll make a very brief response to Rick, and then I do have a question. If you made a list of every school of education in the country, the last institution to change would be Harvard. And I do not say that proudly. I just say that as a fact that Harvard's very conservative definitions of quality and impact are not going to change until much bigger things than the pandemic come along. But my question is, I've spent a lot of time in recent years looking at workforce capacity building, not just teacher workforce, but workforce in general, and co-edited a book called The 60-Year Curriculum that really came out of a lot of work in continuing education, not from schools of education, but from continuing education, about the fact that we're moving into an era where lifelong learning is going to have to be continuous. And we've talked about that for teachers, but it's true in general. Again, it's sort of a question of what is the mission of schools of education? Are we in the education business, or are we in the lifelong learning business? Does our purview end with students getting graduate degrees, or does our purview extend to helping people who are doing workforce capacity building and often doing it in ways that are remote from what we know about learning, for sure. So I'm curious as to whether you see that as part of the future of your schools of education.
Yeah, we definitely do. And I think that's we created actually a master's degree that's like build your own degree. And it has a variety of focal areas, right? Because, and not just in our college, again, looking across all of the university, as you think about people who, look, at the end of the day, we're hoping maybe people stay in the profession maybe a couple more years or whatever that looks like. But I think the day of anybody being in any profession for 20 or 30 years or 10 years, whatever that is, people are much more mobile than that, right? They're looking to advance. They're looking to move on to different things. That's a benefit, but I think we have to address that, and we have to think about then, how do they take the skills and the knowledge that they have in education? How do they take how do they transfer those into other areas, right? And they may stay in education. I mean, we have a degree right now, it's an ed studies degree for students who want to come into education but don't necessarily work in schools. There's 1,000 students in that program right now. I mean, so there's a lot going on there. Just in terms of thinking about education as more than just teachers in classrooms. I don't know what the number is, right? But billions of dollars are spent in education in all different kinds of ways and shapes and forms. And I think it is up to us, right? That we're creating people who actually move into those fields, move into those publishing companies, the corporations, the foundations, the wherever, that know something about education, but again, then take something from another field, right? That they know something maybe about digital marketing, or journalism, or wherever, or they business, or data, literacy. I mean, all kinds of things, economics, law, disabilities law, those kinds of things. That students now are picking up and seeing as valuable, in addition to what we have to offer in education, and putting those things together, because that, I think, is the future of the workforce. It's not going to be one discipline. Just like I talk about research, I don't think the workforce is also going to come from one discipline. We're building in our teacher prep program electives. There've never been electives in teacher preparation, but we've just condensed. We figured out how to put in 9 credits of electives so that students can go across the university and start to think about how they can specialize. So then when they're on teams, right, now, then if we can move, right, to thinking about teams, now we have teams with distributed expertise. We stop building widget teachers. They're not going to be widget teachers. They never really have been. We just keep trying to force them into that. And we've continually, right, provided professional learning that tries to force them into that, into being the best at everything all the time. And so I think that's a misnomer. And so I think that's right, Chris, that as we think about this more as a workforce design problem and solutions, I mean, again, I think this is where it's going to be imperative for us to start looking across other disciplines to see where are those things that we think that educators, not just teachers, but educators overall are really going to need to have in terms of knowledge and skills and dispositions.
Chris, is a great question. And it's, again, there's a lot of challenges. My chancellor likes to talk about the fact that the futurists are saying that kids coming to college now will change careers 5 to 7 times over the course of their lifetime. That's not jobs. That's careers. Now, I'm not sure exactly how we know that, but the reality is that there's certainly going to be some career shifting over time, and so having ongoing lifelong education obviously is going to be important. The dilemma that we all have in the university is that, especially if you're a public institution, is that we have to commoditize what we do so that we can afford to do what we're doing. You can do that through short courses. There's lots of different ways that we can do that, but that has to be a part of the structure. We're all moving to these market-based budgeting models in higher education. I think they're a little short-sighted, but they speak to demand more than they ever have before. And the reality is, and you all probably know this better than I do, is that people who are interested in gathering skills don't have to come to university to do it. I mean, my son, for example, wants to be an influencer online. And so what he does is he watches YouTube videos. Some are $70 an hour, and some are they're of typically not great but varying quality. But that's just one example of the multiple, plenty of private deliverers doing the same thing, and many businesses doing the same thing. So partnerships with businesses. And we don't just do teacher education in my school. I don't think Carole does either. And many schools of education are these omnibus schools that I was just talking online the other day with the dean at Oklahoma State. He's got aircraft, he's got interior design, he's got, I mean, it's this huge set of things that somebody in our role has to consider in what they're doing. That's my long-winded way of saying that I think we won't survive if we don't figure this out, and we have to do it. And that's why I like, Arizona State in many ways is a leader, and I like a lot of things that they're doing where we're going to these kind of competency-based short courses, trying to get videos out to broader, and we've got to figure out ways of doing that. And I think doing that in partnership, for example, we're talking about schools having not enough physics teachers to serve every school. My state has 7 public universities, and I don't know how many private universities. Do we all need large history departments? I'll pick on another field. I don't know. Do we? Is there ways we could share that across ways to do things? I mean, those kinds of discussions need to go forward. I don't know if Arizona State would ever talk to the University of Arizona, but you guys could talk about ways that you might be able to partner to do things that could open up people for doing some of these other kinds of things that we're talking about. My answer to your question is yes, we have to do what you're saying, and B, there's a lot of challenges in pulling all of those things off, and and always have to follow the money, because money's going to drive what any of us do.
Thanks, Rick. So I have one final question. I can't believe time just flies by when you get good people. But anyway, so we always get good people. So Rick and Carole, this is only you can answer this question because you're administrators. None of us here are administrators. I'm really was just wondering, as the dean, looking at your own faculty, what Rick, you were talking about managing people, helping people. Do you think they have become more productive or less productive, and will they become more productive? Just from that, just yes, no, we just got 1 minute, So Rick, you can go first.
Maybe some more productive, some far less productive. And people who are doing field-based research obviously had to shut that down. It was a huge challenge for many people going face-to-face to online. And then it's always harder on women. It's always harder on our colleagues of color. but anybody that had to manage a family and had to figure this out and had to be, I mean, I'm not saying anything that all of us didn't deal with. Some were quite productive. Some were, I think, on the whole, probably likely less productive. If you're talking about scholarship, if you're talking about in terms of the wide breadth of things that they do, everybody was more productive. They learned how to do things in ways. What the good thing about this pandemic, I mean, the move to more technologically driven and more lifelong learning and things like that was happening. The pandemic put all of that on steroids. Everybody learned new stuff. Everybody did. So if you're looking at productivity that way, everybody was incredibly productive.
Thank you, Rick, for that positivity. And Carole, you got about 10 seconds before we run out.
I think they're differently productive. I think everybody is productive. I think they are just differently productive. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much. I need to spend 30 seconds introducing our next episode. We've been talking a lot about transforming schools. We've been talking a lot about personalization of learning. So next week, we have two guests, both from Australia, both school principals. One of them, Peter Hutton, who actually has transformed a school into a personalization school. I wrote about that school many years ago, and that's Peter Hutton. And then we have Michael Ha, who just started a new school in Queensland, Australia, trying to do the similar things. So they will be here. We'll talk a lot about personalization, student-driven, and so our title is Transforming Schools to Personalize Education. Thank you very much. We'll see you next week.